Today I propose to the reader a brief investigation into the history of ideas. It may be somewhat arduous at first, but it will yield valuable insights for understanding many facts of present life. The inconstancy and variety of the ideological discourses of the left and right, not to mention their frequent inversions and mutual graftings, make it so difficult to conceptually grasp the difference between these two political currents that many scholars have given up on trying and opted instead to take them as mere conventional or publicity labels without any precise content. Others, seeing that the zone of indistinction between them broadens over time, have concluded that they made sense originally, but gradually became unusable as descriptive concepts. Despite these reasonable objections, the designations left and right still serve active political groups who, often imbuing them with a powerful emotional charge, use them not only as symbols of self-identification but, conversely, as schematic indicators by which they imaginatively sketch the figure of their ideal adversary and project it, historically, onto this or that social group. When such a paradoxical situation arises, that is, when concepts too fluid or even void of content nonetheless have a real presence as historically active forces, it is because their various and conflicting verbal definitions are only partial and failed attempts to express a datum of reality, an experiential truth, whose unity of meaning, obscurely intuited, remains below the threshold of consciousness of the characters involved and can only be uncovered through the direct analysis of experience as such, that is, taken independently of its historically recorded verbal formulations. In other words, the distinction of right and left exists objectively and is stable enough to be the object of a scientific concept, but it does not consist of anything that the right or left say of themselves or of each other. It consists of a difference between two perceptions of reality, a difference that remains constant throughout all the variations in the meaning of the respective terms, and which, once grasped, allows one to elucidate the unity beneath these variations and explain how they became historically possible. Years ago, I began working on a solution to this problem and from time to time return to it from various angles, always noting that it remains valid. The solution, in dramatically summarized form, is as follows. Right and left, long before being ideological differences or political programs, are two different ways of experiencing historical time. These two ways are both rooted in the founding myth of our civilization, the biblical narrative, which goes from an origin to an end, from Genesis to Apocalypse. Note, reader, that the origin is located in a past so remote, even prior to the counting of human time, that it cannot be conceived historically. It begins in a pre-time or non-time. It begins in eternity. The end, in turn, also cannot be counted as a chapter in the temporal sequence, for it is the cessation and the overcoming of historical flow, the end of times, when the succession of lived moments is reabsorbed into the simultaneity of the eternal. The totality of times, therefore, unfolds within eternity, exactly as any quantity, however immense, is a subset of infinity. The Apostle Paul expresses this exemplarily, saying, "In him, in God, in the infinite, in the eternal, we live, move, and have our being, act, and exist historically, that is, in time." Being framed by eternity is an essential element of the very structure of time. Without being bounded by simultaneity, succession would be impossible. The very idea of time would crumble into a dust of disconnected instants. It is therefore no surprise that historical consciousness forms from within the Judeo-Christian legacy as one of its most typical fruits. But when between the 18th and 19th centuries this consciousness consolidates as an independent domain and flourishes in a variety of manifestations, among which are historical science, philosophy of history, and the vogue of the ideas of progress and evolution, at that very moment the eternal framework disappears and the temporal dimension comes to occupy the entire socially dominant field of vision. One of the first consequences of this narrowing of the horizon is that the ideas of origin and end, no longer referring to a supertemporal dimension, come to be conceived as mere chapters within time, an almost comical incongruity that infects with the germ of irrationality many achievements of a science that promised much. Among the numerous manifestations of intellectual teratology that since then have absorbed the attention of well-intentioned people stand out, for example, the attempts to date the beginning of times from a supposed origin of matter, as if the laws determining the formation of matter did not have to pre-exist it eternally, or the pathetic efforts to encompass the entirety of historical flow within a system of laws that supposedly lead it to a determined final stage, as if the final stage were not just another event in a sequence destined to continue without foreseeable end. If in the higher spheres of thought puerile conceptions blossom everywhere, capturing attention for a few decades only to be then thrown into the dustbin of oblivion, the general disturbance in the perception of time could not fail to manifest itself also, even with increased clarity, in the coarser domains of human mental activity, such as politics. And it is there that the eternal markers of time, reduced to special chapters of the temporal sequence, come to be experienced as two legitimizing symbols of political authority. On one side, the mere temporal antiquity of existing power, which in reality might not have been so old after all, just older than its enemies, seemed to invest it with a heavenly aura. The famous divine right of kings, which in fact was not a very old institution, but the more or less recent result of severing the umbilical cord that tied royal power to the authority of the church, is nothing but the translation into juridical theological language of a temporal experience that identified relative antiquity with absolute origin. On the other side, the perspective of the final judgment, with the reward of the righteous and the punishment of the wicked at the reabsorption of time into eternity, was squeezed into the future image of an earthly kingdom of justice and peace, a perfect political regime that paradoxically would be at once the end of history and the continuation of history. Such is the respective origin of the reactionaries, or conservatives, and the revolutionaries, or progressives. Modern right and left arise from degrading adaptations of mythological symbols, stolen from eternity, compressed into the temporal dimension, and transfigured into gods of the moment. It is evident that, in the structure of real time, there is neither sacred antiquity nor earthly apocalypse, neither divine right of kings nor charisma of the revolutionary prophet. Both are less than myths, for I use the term myth in the noble sense of an archetypal narrative, and not as the opposite of truth. The king is not the power of God, and the revolutionary is not a prophet. They are merely two subjects who imagine themselves important. The first because he takes the antiquity of his family as if it were the origin of times. The second because he attributes to his government projects the mythical grandeur of the final judgment. Right and left have undergone countless variations and combinations over the last centuries. But wherever they appear strongly enough to mutually oppose one another on the political stage, this distinction remains at the core of their discourse. Right is that which legitimizes itself in the name of antiquity, consolidated experience, acquired knowledge, security, and prudence, even when, in practice, it forgets experience, despises knowledge, and, committing all kinds of imprudence, puts general security at risk. Left is that which arrogates to itself in the present the authority and prestige of a beautiful future world of justice, peace, and freedom, even when, in practice, it spreads evil and injustice in doses greater than all that accumulated in the past. The fact that so often the contents of the discourses of right and left blend and confuse themselves is easily explained by the very precariousness of their initial reference symbols, the antiquity and the future, which, being unable to account for concrete reality, dialectically demand to be complemented by their respective opposites, causing, within each of the two mental regions struggling to distinguish and overcome each other, an area that is no longer antagonistic to its adversary, but is its imitation. Thus, for example, conservative permanence can be projected into the future in a kind of utopia of the existent, like the colonial adventures with which kings promised the expansion of the faith. And so the hypothetical future world of the revolutionary seeks to clothe itself with the prestige of origins, presenting itself as the restoration of a lost golden age, as in Rousseau's doctrine of the noble savage or in Karl Marx's primitive communism. It is therefore inevitable that the contents of the respective discourses sometimes confuse themselves, but only rhetorically, since in the sphere of practical action, both the reactionary and the revolutionary firmly cling to their respective orientations in time. Through this distinction, it is possible to grasp the unity among different historical types of rightism and leftism whose variety would otherwise disorient us. Thus, an adherent of classical liberal capitalism could be a leftist in the 18th century because he bet on a utopia of economic freedom of which he had no concrete experience in a universe of mercantilism and monarchical statism. But he is a conservative in the 21st century because he speaks in the name of the acquired experience of 2 centuries of modern capitalism and no longer intends to reach a libertarian paradise, but only to prudently conserve intact the proven means capable of fostering general prosperity. However, he can become a revolutionary in the next instant when he bets that the general expansion of the market economy will produce the global utopia of a world without violence. At each stage of these transformations, the coefficient of leftism and rightism of his position can be measured with reasonable precision. It is also inevitable that, at least at certain moments in the process, leftists and rightists profoundly err in their judgment of themselves or their adversaries. On the part of rightists, both today and throughout the entire 20th century, the great illusion is that of equivalence. Accustomed to the idea that right and left exist as more or less stable facts of the democratic order, they believe this order can be preserved intact and that it is possible to educate leftists to become fond of the rules of the game and no longer attempt to destroy the existing order. On the leftist side, however, this accommodation is impossible. In the world of rightists, there may be rightists and leftists, but in the world of leftists, only leftists have the right to exist. The advent of the leftist kingdom essentially consists in the elimination of all rightists, the complete eradication of the authority of the old. It was for these reasons that the United States peacefully withdrew its troops from the European countries occupied after World War II, believing that the Russians would do the same, when, on the contrary, the Russians had to stay there anyway, because, from the revolution's perspective, the end of one war was only the beginning of another and another and another, until the final extinction of capitalism. The almost unbelievable succession of strategic failures of the right in the world ultimately stems from a structural limitation of rightism. To completely eliminate the left would be a utopia, but the right cannot become utopian without ceasing to be what it is and transforming itself into a revolutionary force, absorbing leftist values and symbols to the point of destroying the very established order it sought to preserve. Fascism, as Erich von Quinhelt-Leden demonstrated in the classic Leftism, from de Sade and Marx to Hitler and Marcuse, 1974, is born of the left and seizes the right in the suicidal illusion of the counter-revolutionary revolution. To be a rightist is to perpetually oscillate between debilitating tolerance and periodic outbursts of uncontrolled, vengeful hatred that are almost always in vain. But the right in Brazil has been decomposing for decades, and it is hardly worth talking about it. The left, for its part, since it relies entirely on the shifting image of a hypothetical future, cannot judge itself by currently existing standards, condemned a priori as residues of an abominable past. Its only commitment is to the future, but the one who invents this future and modifies it according to the strategic and tactical needs of the present is the left itself. By a constitutive fatality of its founding symbol, it is always the legislator who, having no authority above itself, legislates in its own cause, does whatever it pleases, and in its own eyes is right in all circumstances, intoxicated by the vain contemplation of an image of infinite purity and holiness, even when wallowing in a mire of crimes and inequities incomparably greater than all the past evils it promised to eliminate. To be a leftist is to live in a state of profound, structural, and incurable moral disorientation. It is to plunge one's hands into blood and filth, swearing they are being bathed in the cleansing waters of divine redemption. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that the most thieving, most criminal, most perverse party in all our history, the party allied with narco-guerrillas and genocidal dictators, the party that applauded the liquidation of tens of thousands of unarmed Cubans while condemning with paroxysms of indignation the deaths of 300 Brazilian terrorists, the party that condemns bomb attacks when they happen in Spain and applauds those carried out in Brazil, the party that institutionalized Bribery and kickbacks as a system of government is also the party that beats its chest the most, claiming the highest merits and glories. To be a leftist is precisely to be that. Right and left are politicizations of mythological symbols whose original content has become unreachable in common experience. They will exist as long as we remain in the modern cycle, whose essential destiny, as Napoleon Bonaparte rightly saw, is to politicize everything and ignore whatever lies beyond politics. They will not exist forever. But when they cease to exist, politics will have lost at least a good part of the space it usurped from other dimensions of existence.